Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a Polish UK-based author of Slavic-inspired novels for adults and children. Welcome to my channel, where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week, there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. So today I'm really excited to introduce to you my guest, Peter Harling. He's an academic, a project manager, journalist, and a political advisor to numerous publications. He was advisor to Joint United Nations Arab League Special Envoy for Syria Lakhdar Brahimi in 2013. He worked as an expert on a committee for the prevention of conflict at Chirac Foundation in Paris. From 2002 to 2006, he was reporting in and on Iraq for Le Monde Diplomatique. He's also the director of the Synaps Research Center based in Beirut. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, because your career's path's been so varied, could you tell us a little bit about your career path and how you came to be sort of reporting from Middle East on Middle East?
Well, I'm a dropout.
A great start.
I had I devoted my early years as a teenager and then a young adult to sport, in fact, and then I switched to biology, which I studied for a few years and gave up. And so I fell back on political science and the social sciences very much as a dropout, as a
was your backup, basically.
exactly. And it gave me a lot of freedom. I mean, I enjoyed studying science, and I have a rather scientific mind, but I also felt increasingly hemmed in, and was grateful to engage in a career that provided all sorts of opportunities to discover. And so that took me abroad, first to Iraq. I went on an internship to Iraq mostly because my background made it very difficult for me to successfully apply to any internships. And I went to Iraq because the organization I interned with was just desperate for someone. And I stayed for 7 years, and in fact, never left the region, or the Arab world, in which I've been living and working for the past 27 years.
Wow. So that's always comforting, actually. It's like I like to hear of stories where people's first choice wasn't actually the way forward, and then they ended up stumbling onto something that ended up being their life's work, which is pretty cool.
And I think it could have been anything. I could be speaking from South America, but part of what I'm doing now is, in fact, reversing this choice. I'm trying to build myself out of the region. Not that I really want to leave it. I enjoy my life here. I find my work extremely interesting, but I don't belong, however much I try, and want to make sure other voices, more relevant voices, take over. People like me, until recently, would really occupy the kind of front of the scene, speak in other people's names, and it's time to stop doing that. And so, through my work, I'm currently trying to encourage young people to take over, and building myself out of a job. I'd like to devote my work to societies I'm more familiar with. Well, in fact, societies I kind of historically belong to. I'm British, but I grew up in France. Europe is going through its own crisis. And that's something I'd like to grapple with, but it's a process of rediscovery. After 27 years living abroad, I can't claim to know much about our own societies, especially kind of the depth of them. And so it's going to be a really interesting undertaking, yes, to kind of resume where I left. I in France, I grew up in an environment very similar to what was described as the Gilets jaunes, who rose up a couple of years ago, and I was shocked at the time by how little I knew about that social milieu I used to belong to, and how little they would accept me. And so it was like a wake-up call in terms of the need to re-engage, to overcome some of those barriers, even within a society I supposedly belong to.
I mean, I think because speaking as a migrant myself, right? I'm Polish and I live in the UK, and I very well understand this sense of not being fully accepted anywhere anymore. Most Polish people I know feel very strongly I should not be allowed to speak on Poland, for example,
Yes.
anymore, especially critically. I mean, I can spread spread the gospel of the Polish culture and its richness and Slavic folklore and all that, but I should not say anything critical about it. And I think at the moment we're in that time in politics where people are more interested about who is allowed to talk about what, which sometimes I think doesn't take into account people's individual history and individual experiences as well.
Yes, I don't believe that we should all be embedded within that part of society we truly belong to. On the contrary, I do think we, especially as a researcher, as an intellectual, as someone who engages in public speaking, I see my role as overcoming those barriers, and it's not
bringing
just
a unique perspective as well. I think
exactly. It's not just an intellectual leap. It's an experience that is transformative, right? The only way to understand someone else is to kind of, in part, become that other person through learning languages, but also a different way of life, social codes, and whatnot, even kind of dress codes, you name it. But I just to me, that's very interesting to have. It's interesting for me to be working in the Arab world, as it's interesting, I think, for us in Europe to have Arab academics who study us as an object of scrutiny. But I just believe that given how relations developed historically, there is a need for rebalancing the mechanisms of knowledge production. And so my positioning today in the Arab world is ambiguous, and I'm trying to correct that.
Do you think that historically it was simply easier for people in Europe to accept political analysis on the Middle East from someone like you rather than people from the countries?
I don't know that it was easier. To accept part of this was kind of organic in terms of how the media landscape emerged. If you take news agencies, historically, they're kind of Western creatures, right? And they came to dominate the production of news. In the Arab world, you have national news agencies in most countries, but they also don't fulfill their function. As a rule, they kind of reverberate official statements, which are extremely bland and kind of lack content, and therefore make themselves uninteresting to their own target audience, although they speak about Syria, Egypt, Libya, or other countries in Arabic on a day-to-day basis, but very few people actually pay attention, right? So part of this is not an expression of a desire to dominate the news cycle, but de facto, the news cycle is very much manufactured in the West, and that's only gradually being corrected. I mean, a phenomenon like Al Jazeera goes back to the 70s, to the 90s. they were very quick to catch on to the kind of 24-hour news cycle first introduced by CNN, but Al Jazeera emerged very soon thereafter and has been playing an extremely significant role ever since. But much of the kind of the resources, even in terms of human resources and how you produce cohorts of journalists, much of that is still based in the West.
I think things are changing so quickly, I think, in the media, especially in the perception of media. And something I wanted to ask you about is a kind of a heterodoxy of opinions presented in the sort of mainstream media, which is like, the balance between allowing a larger plurality of voices versus allowing the sort of extremes in and how it affects the current political climate.
Well, I think there are different ways of introducing this plurality. And I think in the current context, it's all about creating controversy and conflict because that's clickbait. So I don't know that this is a genuine form of plurality, nor that the media have an interest, an economic interest, in creating that plurality. So some would try harder than others. You have some kind of public service, radios, for instance, that would make more of an effort. And of course, I think you have a kind of sampling bias that's built into how editors would view the world, right? So, but they do try to introduce a more interesting form of plurality than you would see on most televisions, and of course, kind of profit-driven media, let alone social media, which is extremely polarizing and will kind of set people up against each other, often representing positions that are quite far from what they actually think, which is generally more nuanced than what they would convey in the public space.
I think we'll definitely come back to sort of social media because it's so important right now. But going back to sort of traditional media, I think there is a definite deterioration in the public perception of traditional media, in the sense that historically we have there's all those checks and balances on traditional media that you're supposed to create, like in many countries at least, but you're supposed to create like a sense of balance. So, you don't just present one viewpoint, but this issue with this approach is that if you're forced to include opinions that are like blatantly non-factual, such as, climate change deniers, and then, you have one climate change denier and then you have one climate change scientist, or you have one vaccine researcher and then one anti-vaxxer. So when did this attention to fairness degenerate into what we now call post-truth society? When did this become so extreme in your view?
Well, I mean, claiming that we're in a post-truth society implies that we were at some point in a truth society, which to me is...
It's all about perception, though, isn't it?
Well, it's a bit of a leap. I mean, to me, it's a symptom of a crisis in self-confidence, but it's not a statement that would be kind of historically valid in any way. At any point in time, our societies were indulging in all sorts of beliefs and biases and rumors, and I think that's very much how societies function in part, right? So information and fact would coexist at any point in time with an enormous amount of narrative and perception and emotion and so forth. So I think social media simply and social media themselves are changing, very fast. And so we're in different stages of the same phenomenon. I don't know that it's getting necessarily worse. I think that can be debated. But there is a sense of nostalgia, of loss. I think the
Yes.
loss is that self-confidence. I think we're emerging from an era in which we had faith in our democratic values and our economic systems and the notion of progress defined by science and the kind of cohesion of our societies, in our educational systems, and so forth. And I think today we're in an interesting moment in time where everything seems to be open to questioning, for better or worse. But that's also creating a sense of panic.
I mean, isn't at least when it comes to scientific progress, I feel like maybe that sense of nostalgia has some basis in reality, at least for me, because I grew up in the 90s where, it feels like every every other month scientists would present, some kind of new discovery, or, oh, we cloned a sheep, we eradicated polio in India, we have this we're looking at to find clean energy sources. And I feel like a lot of scientists now spend half their time shouting at flat earthers and anti-vaxxers online.
Well, I think we'd have to unpack, each of the items. So the way to sum it up, the way I see it is that we were, at least again in the West, because things might be following a very different timeline in other parts of the world, but we were immersed in what I call an ideology of progress, which has roots in the Renaissance and then in the 18th century. Increasingly, we overinvest this notion that all our problems will be solved through science innovation. Kind of new technicalities, right? So we can discard religion and philosophy and common sense and hope for the best. And I think that kind of corresponds to a curve in terms of life expectancy gains, access to healthcare, redistribution in the form of an emerging middle class, education for all, democratic rights, and so forth, right? So what's changed is the perception, in the sense that we fear now regression. We fear at least the notion that we have peaked, which may be the case or not. I actually see the world as in a tremendously good shape today. Like we've never had this, healthcare on such a broad base. We're doing extremely well when it comes to indeed not just polio, but so many other diseases. Education maybe has peaked, but at a remarkably high level, accessible to so many. Most of the problems we have, in fact, are well studied, and there's information out there which is easy to find, easier than ever, kind of consolidated. It's simply not implemented, right? So I think the sense of panic I mentioned also comes from the fact that we have all these resources. We are in a beautiful world, and yet we're told every day relentlessly that we're on the verge of disaster, and no one seems to be taking measures on a scale of the catastrophes we're talking about, although we do enjoy the level of knowledge needed to tackle them. So I think that tension, that kind of fundamental contradiction, is part of the crisis we're in, right? So then I think there's this other phenomenon of kind of denying some kind of evident facts or challenging science, but that's something else which I think is worthy of attention, and I would even say worthy of respect. I think there's every reason to be worried. There's every reason to be anxious, and dismissing this anxiety and the supposedly irrational forms it takes is a mistake, because people do deserve to be taken seriously, even when they make outrageous statements, because those outrageous statements might be simply an expression of their emotional state, rather than their kind of deeply held.
I think
belief.
there's a lot to unpack here. And I was thinking about how, absolutely, when it comes to, when you look globally, right, like human population has never been, this healthy on a global scale. It has never been this wealthy on a global scale. And then, but I think a lot of the fear comes from like examples where that can be taken back very, very quickly. And it is. And, when we see what's, women in Afghanistan and their situation there, or even on a smaller scale, what's happening in the States when it comes to women's reproductive rights. And I think there is a lot of very legitimate fear when it comes to certain things being pulled back or, pulled away. And I think it's sort of taking it back to what you said about our sort of sense, maybe false sense of security in political structures. Like in Poland, in the UK, under Boris Johnson, I think a lot of commentators were talking about how many rules of conduct that we assume are the law when it comes to the conduct of our politicians actually are customary. And there's a lot of political structures in the UK, especially, that rely very heavily on the assumption of honorable conduct. So, how do you view that, and that change in terms of how we perceive the fragility of our political structures?
Well, on the sense of loss, I think it's palpable and it's real within our own societies. I think the bulk of our societies could measure, in fact, in their daily lives, their own losses without getting into more kind of statistical realities, such as losses in terms of life expectancy gains. I mean, these have been slowing for societies as a whole. They've actually been reversed for the more vulnerable. So people no longer can expect life expectancy gains. They're actually dying sooner, right? And I think they may not see the data, but anecdotally around them, they can perceive this, along with, quality of life, the cost of basic goods, the struggle to access primary healthcare in places like the UK, France, and elsewhere, right? And this has nothing to do with climate change or migration, or and people can sense that, but that's all they hear on the part of their representatives, right? They'll have these this vision of leadership, which seems to be focused on anything but their own concerns, clueless when it comes to actually diagnosing their anxiety and their fears, and proposing public policy options that would make sense and produce results. Meanwhile, kind of constantly distracted by other topics, right? Jet setting around the world, and indeed behaving in ways that are undignified, whether they actually are corrupt or not. And so I think that kind of spectacle of power is contributing to this anger, which will be expressed in different ways at the polls, but also through rejection of science, anti-elitism. I think, denying science is also a form of anti-elitism. So these things tend to come together. I think it's essential to, recognize that such anger has grounds, and that basis must be tackled rather than simply, satisfying ourselves with contempt for those people who make the wrong decisions when they go to the polls.
Yes, I mean, contempt is not a productive form of action. But I was, or action at all, actually. I was thinking about, like, when you mentioned spectacle, obviously I have to mention it because it only happened like a couple of days ago. You know, the sort of shameful display that Trump sort of presented us with and his treatment of President Zelensky. Of course, you know, like people, like, you know, myself from Eastern Europe are kind of used to the fact that in the so-called like West, you know, like the US, the UK, Poles, Ukrainians are kind of seen as like a lesser form of European. But this, I was wondering what the perception of that circus was in the Middle East, because, you know, I feel like this disdain that I think that the thing that was so shocking for everyone was this obvious disdain that, you know, Trump showed towards President Zelensky. But I feel like this disdain in a way has existed a long time, just directed towards the Middle East. And it was, you know, would you agree with that? Is it, you know, just racism, like the way that American politicians, you know, UK politicians have been treating representatives of, you know, Middle Eastern countries, or like, you know, people from Middle Eastern countries? How's it, the perception of that where you are?
So the Zelensky affair is not something that would grab attention in the Arab world, by contrast with Gaza, and kind of vice versa. In Europe, we would focus on one and kind of do everything up to see
more pressing, yeah.
Well, it's not more pressing. I mean, you know, an ongoing genocide on the shores of the Mediterranean is a pressing concern. The fact that we're dismantling international humanitarian law, which is very much a European construct to serve our own interests. Well, that's also a pressing preoccupation, even in relation to Ukraine. You know, it's called international humanitarian law, so it kind of applies across the board. So you can't the board. So you can't be shoring it up in one place while undermining it in another, right? So I think this notion that Ukraine is a European concern, Gaza is not, is very naive. Gaza is as close to Europe as Ukraine is, and the Arab world is our neighborhood, has always been, historically even more so than Ukraine. So things can change in the short term, but if you look at centuries, there's as much of a reason to include Eastern Europe in our understanding of ourselves as there is the Mediterranean and the other, the southern shore of the Mediterranean. So to me, what's interesting with that whole affair is what it says about how figures and forms of leadership are evolving, and there's a temptation to treat Trump as this anomaly, when in fact he's extremely kind of representative. He just takes things further, makes them more vulgar and crass and extreme. But his behavior, his instincts are not different from many other leaders who would do pretty much the same thing, but in more subtle ways. In fact, you have kind of two templates for the forms of leadership we witness and endure these days. One is Blair, and the other is Berlusconi. Berlusconi kind of pioneered this vulgar, crass, provocative style, which kind of mutated over the years into the likes of Trump. There are many others, kind of the populist model of leadership. Blair is somebody who kind of embodies this spitefulness, the self-confidence, the arrogance, the vacuousness. Also, he built himself at the expense of his own party and kind of turned politics into a personality cult. And so he kind of spawned a whole generation. Which we can recognize in the likes of Obama or Macron or Trudeau and so forth, right? So very shallow politics, personality-based, doing away with the parties, like the conventional parties themselves.
Isn't it like
Very kind of
Americanization?
and opportunistic.
Isn't it like Americanization of, because you do talk a lot about hyper individuality in politics, and I do want to ask you about it. At first, I was wondering if it's Americanization of UK politics, for example, because this cult of an individual. You had that stretches quite far back in American politics, whereas in the UK it was supposed to be always, the party, and like, the prime minister is the leader of a party rather than it being, him being chosen as an individual by the population.
No, I mean, I think in the US, historically, on the contrary, you had this bipartisan structure, two very powerful parties dividing the scene and producing their forms of leadership. Obama is a break from that model because he leverages social media, a whole new generation of activists and supporters who don't really belong to the Democratic Party. And by the way, 2 years into power, he loses his majority in Congress to the Republicans, not least because of how he ran his campaign, disregarding the party. And so that's been kind of reinforced ever since. Under Biden, but it's happening on the same in the same ways on the Republican side of the aisle, and it's been happening in sync with Europe. So not everywhere, but France is a similar example where you historically have these two massive traditional parties, the Socialist Party and the Republican Party, although they've carried different names over the years. They've essentially disappeared at this point. And so we have a kind of spattering of parties and an inability to recognize this new reality and form coalitions. And not least because the individuals in charge of these various factions are very self-centered, non-ideological, expressing their kind of personal, ordinary biases and prejudice more than some kind of outlook that could lead to actual policy making. So I think that shift we're seeing everywhere, shift away from structures, partisan structures, ideological structures, strategic perspectives that kind of bind our foreign policy, for instance, and towards a much more instinctive, personality-based rapport with politics.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting what you're talking about in terms of values, because that is another thing that I think we used to kind of subconsciously in Europe, at least, rely on, as in, this politician belonging to this party represents a certain values, and even if they vote in a way that might not completely align with them, they will always try to kind of center towards those values. And so if I vote for this person, I can kind of rely on them following through. Whereas now it feels very much, I mean, that is anecdotal, but of course, I'm one of those annoying constituents who kind of regularly writes to my MP to express my dissatisfaction on certain sort of policies and issues. And I feel very often like the party I vote for, they don't seem to represent the values anymore. It's very much, you know, I will say anything and do anything to get into power and stay in power. And then the MPs don't, you know, will never express like, you know, this is something I believe in. It's just more like, you know, I will do what the leader says, which runs contrary to how I understand the, you know, the party to.
Well, I mean, to me, we can't blame politicians for being ego-driven. It's part of the job description.
Of course, yeah.
So kind of doing everything they can to claim.
I mean, but we hope that they'd be value-driven.
Exactly. Right? But what to me is, well, what's different is that they're only ego-driven at this point, right? Whereas I think in the past we were represented by forms of leadership that had a broader base, broader than their own ego. So the ego was part of the drive, of course, but they had an ideological base, they had a partisan base, they had a bureaucratic base, they had a base in how society was being transformed. For instance, people would emerge to represent a new social, you know, the ascent of a social category. For instance, the middle class, which is very much a 20th century exception. Whereas today they represent only themselves, right? And make a claim, of course, to be more than that. But it's a very shallow claim. I think everyone can sense that it is. So the fact that we're not in a post-truth world, but we're in a post-ideological world, I think that indeed poses a problem, because everything is just transactional and opportunistic, and very easily kind of reversed or ignored, not least because the media cycle is such that we're constantly moving on to the next topic. So whatever you say on one day is kind of drowned out by what happens the following week. And that's become part of how our politicians function. They have completely fused with the news cycle, and typically tend to disregard their own bureaucracies. So the ability of bureaucracies to kind of create structure, produce policies, roll them out, even as the media circus moves on, that is disappearing gradually. We're seeing a kind of dismantling of that capacity for public policy, which again, I think people can perceive. They see how, for instance, the healthcare system, and God knows how intimate, you know, how existential that is, or how the education system are being eroded over the years, provoking no response.
I think, you know, when it comes to the news cycle in general, I feel like the traditional meaning of the news cycle, and you know, that's shifted completely with, you know, more and more people get their news exclusively off social media, and not even from articles that are linked to on social media. They just get it from the headlines, or, you know, second, third, fourth hand analysis of a headline. And you know, there is an issue of like, you know, how do you counter this sort of also constant disinformation that is being, you know, rolled out quite deliberately?
So I have a different take on such things. Social media function like a rumor, right? A rumor is a story, as you study storytelling. Is a rumor isn't so much a fact, right? Typically, rumors can be debunked, but they circulate because people want to relay them. There is something in a rumor people want to believe in. Right? And typically it's not the fact itself, it's what the fact says about the world we're in, who we are, where we're going. what problems we face. So a rumor functions also like a metaphor, right? It's kind of naive to stop at the literal sense of a rumor because its power is precisely in the implied. Typically a message, a story, which we wouldn't quite dare say explicitly, and therefore the rumor comes in to propagate this this message in an implicit framing, right? So social media function pretty much the same way, right? People are clicking like or sharing what resonates with them emotionally, right? So it's not necessarily the exact episode being described, the facts involved, or the literal meaning in a post. It's very much, you know, how it kind of echoes within us. And that's what will prompt a response. Now, a big chunk of the kind of social media sector as an industry is all about provoking that response. You know, that's how you generate content. That's how you become an influencer. That's how you build your following. That's how you get the buzz, and so forth. So you're kind of instinctively or very methodically seeking to trigger people's emotions, to click, you know, to connect with them on that level. So I think it's, you know, it's naive really, and in fact counterproductive to constantly try to debunk fake news. To me, what's missing is proper news. And people tend to turn to these alternative news sources out of frustration with the lack or the unsatisfying nature of conventional news. I'll give myself as an example because I'm, you know, so I don't consume that much social media. But for instance, I used to turn to The Economist as a kind of steady source of, you know, reliable information. In fact, most dominant mainstream daily publications, the New York Times, Le Monde in France, and so on, have been doing reasonably well because there is a need for a place to go that offers a standard take on the world, right? So people subscribe and pay for that service because it's hard to do without. But if you take my example and The Economist, I just gave up because the way, you know, they're very good in some ways, but they're just so absolutely ideological in ways that are just frustrating that they force me to go and find my news elsewhere. And there aren't so many places to go. So if you take the Arab world, right, it's actually very, or if you take Lebanon, where I'm speaking from, or Syria, or you know, where very consequential things are happening right now, it's surprisingly difficult to get the news. So it's kind of on me to find my way through all sorts of secondary publications and posts on social media and reassemble all this into the news. Now, I can do that because it's, in a sense, my profession. Most people will kind of drift and just click based on what clicks with them.
I mean, I feel like that leads to like a positive side I feel of social media, which is that it does fill the gap of a lack of where we have a lack of information on the ground. And, you know, mentioning the frustration with Western sort of traditional media is, for example, very visible to me, at least in how the Israel's sort of occupation of Palestine what has been represented historically, in that social media did fill that gap, especially when it comes to video footage of, you know, this is happening in real time. You get to see a live video from Gaza or any, you know, that really I feel has shifted the kind of wider public opinion in a way that a lot of traditional media outlets are now changing their position on the situation there, but they're kind of playing catch up So what do you think the potential is when it comes to, how should the traditional media outlets respond to that shift?
Well, you have to keep in mind that writing the news is a difficult and, most importantly, a costly process. Most of the networks of correspondence abroad, for instance, or even correspondence within our own countries have shrunk dramatically. So you have fewer and fewer people doing more and more, and not least because they have to do multiple formats, right? So they'll have to do print and copywriting, but they also have to do audiovisual. They have to do some social media content and whatnot. So they're one-person orchestras with very few resources. It's an extremely competitive line of work. So you can also extract work from people at a low cost. So social media kind of is producing content that feeds into this as a way of cutting those costs, right? And generating ever more content ever faster with fewer means. So it's not just social media that would be a problem. It's how it interacts with the conventional media. And then I think the problem with social media isn't so much the fake news and whatnot. It's really how it functions as a media, the fact that it's audiovisual, it's very literal, it kind of hits you hard. There's very little capacity on the part of consumers to distance themselves. It's easier with text to process things when it's kind of images that hit you as you scroll. Then it becomes kind of, it leaves an imprint on you. It's they're designed to put you on the loop, to reinforce your prejudice, to give you ever more of the same, to bring out those kind of obsessive behaviors. So that's part of how they've been designed. So they're addictive by nature, and have developed all sorts of tricks to increase this effect. So to me, the fake news part is really not what I worry about. I worry more about kind of mental health. And I've seen many people around me, smart people, reasonable people, well-informed, just implode over a particular topic and how it is documented through social media. Now, I think AI is also going to make things a bit worse in terms of producing this flood of cheap, like it's cheap for those who produce it. It's actually costly on a more collective social scale, but a flood of unreliable, not just information, but visual information. Right,
Yes.
so videos are still extremely crummy for now, but
I've
images are
seen more
very
and
hard.
more. I've
Yes.
seen more and more videos produced by AI that are just on a phone screen, on a small screen.
Yeah.
They're becoming more and more difficult to tell, and that takes me to my question about it's not so much fake news. It's not so much it's not even about debunking or anything like that. It's the fact that we seem to be inching closer to sort of post-internet society, I would think. It's something that people have kind of mentioned in a laughing tone, 10 years ago. But now, there's more and more commentators saying that with the AI and with the deep fakes, which are becoming more and more prolific, right? In advertising sphere, for example, you have a lot of doctors who have their, for example, YouTube channel is a doctor who talks about women's health. And I saw her video and she said, but basically, look at this video. It's my voice. It's my face. It's me talking about this product that I think is absolute rubbish. And I never agreed to this. And they took my voice, my image, and they've created something so obviously, fake. And what do you think is going to fill the gap if internet becomes unusable as a source of any information? You know, the other day I posted a picture. I took a picture in local Lidl of a newsstand because I like the fact that all the newspapers had this anti-AI copyright amendment covers. So it was like, you know, I thought, well, isn't this interesting? I can't think of a time when all the UK newspapers agreed on anything. And immediately I got messages like, oh, you photoshopped it. Did you use AI to to amend this photo? Which means that I think we're getting closer to the post-internet age because people just don't trust anything at all anymore.
Definitely, things can for now. I don't think AI makes a huge difference. It reinforces a number of trends which we've been suffering from for some time. So, increasing volumes of kind of informational products, the lack of respect for copyright, which isn't new, and intellectual property and intellectual work, creative work. The distrust in kind of, instinctive distrust in all content, the very, selective choice of what appeals to us and whatnot. The fact that these volumes are also undermining, kind of drowning out the more quality content and so forth. So AI just makes all of that work. Maybe it will also prompt a reaction. For instance, you can share digital products that are authenticated, right? I struggle with this with my own researchers. You can't just kind of share a screenshot, you need a source, you need a timestamp, you need, there are some basics which have been lost in recent years as everything became so democratized and spontaneous. It's kind of everyone contributing to the flood. That's the genius of social media, to turn everyone into content producers and consumers at no cost to the platforms themselves, right? So we're all kind of devouring each other. But I do hope that we will see, as distrust deepens, which I think is inevitable. I do hope that we'll see more resources going into kind of information education, just the basics, and also best practices on the part of those media, those professionals whom we do want to turn to. Basically, what I see on the part of people around me in our own audiences, if you will, is this desperate scramble to find trusted resources. I don't think people are just sucking up nonsense on the web. I think they are actually trying both to service their emotional needs on one side, and that's problematic, but also problematic yet natural, but also trying to build an understanding of this world, navigate a very confusing era through a network of people they rely on for quality information. These can be professionals or people they know or simply follow, and so this was a function that used to be fulfilled by your mainstream media. The curation of information was a job for professionals. Now it's a job everyone has to take up. And so I'm hoping that particular gap, will be filled at some point. We're all we're still adjusting to the social media era. We kind of gave up on email because we felt overwhelmed, and then started following thousands of people on multiple platforms and kind of parsing that mess. I don't think we'll stay stuck there forever. We're just waiting for some solution to this information overload.
Yes, I think that being accessible to everybody you've ever met, or everybody who has visibility of you online, is exhausting mentally as well. And it just, yeah. On that note, I wanted to ask you about your Synaps network, because you're the founder and director of the Synaps network. Can you tell our listeners what that is and what it is that you do?
Well, definitely, I have a sense of what we do, although we've had a very experimental approach to information. So we're a research organization, but one which is interested not in producing more knowledge for the sake of it. We're interested in solving information problems, right? So you might have too much information. How do you curate it? How do you synthesize it? How do you extract some intellectual value from it? You might have information gaps. So, for instance, it could be like remote places or countries at war. It can be social groups which are difficult to know much about. Take migrant workers. So we're talking about migrant workers all the time, right? But we don't know much about them, and they're a very difficult group to research. They work in the informal economy. They're very vulnerable. They have very little time on their hands. These are people that are
Is it like
difficult.
migrant workers anywhere, or do you speak specifically of
Well,
like
not
countries
least
like
because
Lebanon and
they're on the move. No, they're difficult to work on anywhere. In fact, poverty as a topic is very difficult to research for a variety of reasons, but one of them methodologically is that the poor have very little time on their hands, right? So it's much easier for you and me to set up a 1 hour conversation. When someone has multiple jobs, little access to communication tools, they might have a phone, but it's damaged, and they struggle to buy credit and recharge it and whatnot. I mean, to charge the battery and so forth. So they have family obligations in addition to those multiple jobs. So it makes it very difficult to produce knowledge on a topic which apparently is important, as we're talking about it all the time. Take children. Working on children is also difficult for ethical reasons. How do you include children in knowledge production, given the kind of cognitive gap between them and adults? So that's some of the problems we work on. The problem might be kind of information management. How do you store information? How do you recall information? How do you process it using technology? We do a lot of software development, for instance. So we're bridging these different needs, always with a sense of accountability to the public, right? So producing more information only makes sense if you have a very clear idea about who it will be delivered to what end, and then how. Because just sending people this massive report, for instance, condemns it to just being archived, shelved, never read or used. So a lot of the work we do consists in figuring out how information becomes knowledge that's used in our systems. And that means finding the right formats, understanding also, if you take policy making, well, how exactly that functions and how do you fit in. So we're a research organization that functions like a laboratory. We take up problems and design kind of information solutions on a case-by-case basis.
All right. And I will post a link under the video to it so everyone can check this out for themselves. And on that note, thank you so much for coming on to chat with me. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you, and see you next week.